In the previous video, we prepared our previs sets and added some animated actor stand-ins. It's finally time to light and film out our virtual set. Let's get right to it. It would be foolish to expect Unreal Engine to give you a perfect representation of your final scene lighting, but it will at least help you get a general sense of where your lights need to be positioned and, by extension, whether they'll fit the space. Start by adding a ceiling to the shot. A simple cube from the Modes pane will do. Scale it to fit the floor plan, and then position it appropriately. Now rename it in the World Outliner so that it's easy to locate and toggle on and off. It's important for lighting, but we want to be able to remove it whenever we're focused on adding scene items or repositioning them. Let's rebuild the lighting. Notice how from the outside, looking through the windows, the house now appears dark. But when we move inside, things begin to brighten up. That's because Unreal Engine includes an auto exposure adjustment so that game characters can move from light to dark areas and have the illusion of their eyes adjusting to the dark. Don't worry, we'll deactivate this when we get to working with cameras. If you're going to be shooting the real set during the day and working with light coming through windows, balancing all your lighting to daylight temperatures, you can continue to use the default sky lighting as a starting point. For this exercise, we'll assume a nighttime shoot and that all lighting will be created on set. So let's delete all of the starter content that's currently illuminating the set. We'll right-click our starter content folder and choose Select All Descendants. Control-click to add the folders to the selection as well. Then we'll press the Delete key and confirm by clicking Yes All. Rebuild the lighting. You may notice a few of the mirrors in the scene will still show light. Some props use texturing tricks to simulate reflections, and these work independently of the scene lighting. To remove these, just select the prop and change the mirror material to a more generic material instead. Now, once the lighting is set up, these won't be noticeable, so we'll just press Ctrl-Z on a PC, Command-Z on a Mac to undo. Time to add some lights. Deactivate the ceiling for now. From the Modes pane, jump to the Lights tab, make sure you're in the main Place section at the top, and drag a spotlight into the scene. We'll start by adding a fill light. For more information on lighting technique, be sure to watch our videos on 3-point lighting fundamentals. There aren't any true soft light sources in Unreal Engine by default, so we'll fake one by creating a spotlight with an extremely wide angle. We'll set the inner cone angle to 80 degrees and the outer cone angle to 90 degrees. Now we'll just rotate and position the light as a standard fill light source. There's no point in adjusting its intensity until we have the other lights set up. What we will do, however, is create a unique folder for lighting elements, rename our fill light. To rename an item, click once to select it, and then click again to rename, and drag it into the new folder. Next, we'll drag in another spotlight and set it up at the 45-degree key light position, being careful not to move it above the ceiling height since that would be impossible to reproduce on an actual set. Here, we'll move the timeline forward to make sure Jennifer's in her main position for the dialogue. No point in adjusting lights without her at her mark. We'll rename and drag our key light into the new lighting folder. And finally, we'll add a couple of rim lights. A quick but important note here. We're demonstrating a classic 3-point light setup for the sake of showing basic staging, but from an aesthetic standpoint, it's important to note that this probably isn't a particularly appropriate lighting setup for this scene. Time to dial in the intensity of our lights. Remember that Unreal Engine will automatically adjust the exposure with each lighting change, and right now this is starting to get old. It's making it extremely difficult to judge the effect of our lighting changes. Go to Edit, Project Settings, Engine, Rendering, and deselect Auto Exposure in the Default Settings section. Depending on your lighting setup, you may need to rebuild lighting again to see the full effects. Now we can adjust our key, fill, and rim lights without Unreal altering the overall balance. Rebuild your lighting after each significant change to review. You'll find that as you increase the number of lights in your scene, the rebuild will begin to take longer to compute. Now continue to add additional lights to illuminate the surrounding set as needed. For these additional lights, set their mobility to static. There are only so many overlapping lights that Unreal can simulate in real time, for the time we recorded this, and we want to save those for the lights that illuminate our actors. When too many real-time lights overlap, some of the lights will show X's on their icons, indicating the problem. To get rid of any problem X's on your lights, change any lights that don't directly affect your characters to static, and then rebuild the lighting. To simulate lights like China balls that radiate in all directions, use a point light instead of a spot. While Unreal won't give you a perfect match to the real lighting of your final set, it will offer a pretty good idea of the number of lights that will be required to successfully light your scene. This could save you from ending up with the amateurish footage filled with dark patches that so often shows up in indie film work. New filmmakers often forget that the practical lighting of a location like a suburban house needs to be turned off and replaced with stage lighting due to the mismatch in color temperatures. We cover this in our video series on lighting control. This process of fully lighting the scene should also make you mindful of how many watts of power will be required and whether you'll need to rent a generator for the shoot. Be sure to watch our videos on on-set electrical for more information. As you work, be sure to periodically enable the ceiling to make sure you haven't designed any impossible lighting angles. Ideally, you should always have the ceiling enabled when rebuilding your lighting, as the light will bounce off the ceiling and produce a stronger overall illumination. There are dozens of ways to improve the lighting quality. We've only scratched the surface here. When you're done with your major adjustments, change the lighting quality to production. This will dramatically increase build times, but produce more accurate lighting detail. And finally, it's time to add our camera blockings. We'll start by framing the viewer for a basic two-shot. Click the Add Camera button in the sequencer, and a new camera is added to the scene, along with an animation track for it in the sequencer. The viewport changes a little, indicating that we're now looking through the newly created camera instead of the generic perspective view. If things look a little blurry, it's because your camera is out of focus. In the Details pane, your new camera should still be selected, and if not, select it in the World Outliner. Expand Focus Settings. Click the eyedropper next to the manual focus distance and click one of your characters. We'll click Jennifer, and the camera matches its focal point to her. If you look through the camera settings, you'll see the typical properties you're used to seeing in cameras and lenses. Let's assume we're shooting with a digital SLR. In that case, we'll leave the film back settings fixed to a 16:9 non-crop DSLR and choose a 30mm prime lens. To fine-tune the focus, enable Draw Debug Focus Plane. You'll now see a violet plane slicing through the image, indicating the current center of focus. We'll drag just on the right edge of the manual focus distance numeric entry field to adjust the plane, splitting the difference between Richard and Jennifer, and then we'll deselect the debug switch. And for a more dramatic depth of field effect, we'll set the aperture to 1.4. Notice how the kitchen now looks significantly out of focus. Additional settings like vignetting and chromatic aberration are available in the lens section of the Details pane. If your production budget permits, Unreal Engine also provides crane and dolly rail rigs to simulate those kinds of camera moves. These can be found in the Cinematic section of the Modes pane's Place tab. Now, the viewer can be a little confusing once you've added custom cameras, so to help keep things straight, click the Viewport Options drop-down and choose a two-pane layout. In one of the new panes, select Perspective, and in the other pane, change the viewport type to Cinematic, and then select your camera. The Cinematic Viewer gives you a better way to look at your final camera angles and includes transport controls and a timeline for quick navigation through your scene. Let's rename the camera to Two-Shot while we're here. Before we move on, let's look at a couple of options in the viewer. In the upper right corner, you can select from a number of overlays, including a rule of thirds overlay for quick composition help. You can also hide all of the element icons by choosing Game View from the viewport options. However, be careful. If you can see light icons in your viewer, then there's a good chance that the real-world rigging will show up in your final shoot. In other words, it's usually better to leave the icons active by leaving Game View deselected, at least until your final render out. Let's look at moving the camera. Click into the other default perspective viewport and then select your camera in the World Outliner. A preview of your selected camera's framing appears as a picture-in-picture. Press F to frame the camera in our perspective viewport. Seeing as we have this dedicated cinematic viewport for seeing through the camera's framing, we don't need the picture-in-picture overlay as well. So we'll disable it via Edit, Editor Preferences, Level Editor, Viewports, Preview Selected Cameras. You can now adjust the camera in the default perspective view using the standard Move and Rotate keyboard and mouse shortcuts. We'll angle the camera and adjust its height to crop the lights out of the shot. Remember, you can disable angle snapping by deselecting the snap button here. Alternatively, you can move the camera by holding down the right mouse button over the viewport and using the standard gaming keys Q, W, E, A, S, and D to move and the mouse to rotate. Remember to readjust your focus distance when you're done. Once you're satisfied with the position of your camera, click the Unlock Camera from Viewport button to detach it from the viewer, preventing you from accidentally changing the framing. Now we'll select Richard, press F to frame him, and move the perspective to an over-the-shoulder shot. We'll then create a new camera, and then click to rename it OTS of Richard. We can then select it in the viewport, adjust the framing a little, and use the focus eyedropper to focus directly on Richard. Repeat the process for each additional angle you want to represent. And for organization's sake, we'll create a separate folder for our cameras. Now, most of your camera angles will be lockdowns, but a handful will be moving cameras. So let's take a look at animating a camera move. We'll create a dolly jib shot starting on Jennifer's feet as she walks, pulling up to a medium by the time she arrives in the living room. A quick note, this is the kind of shot that's easy to pull off here in Unreal, but takes a lot of work in the real world. It's unlikely that you'd fit a doorway dolly with a jib arm into the narrow space of this kitchen area. You might be able to get away with a Dana dolly, but rigging a jib to it will be an exercise in frustration. So we'll use this shot here as an example because, hey, it's a cool shot. But it's a great example of the kind of shot that you should rule out during the previs stage unless you have the ability to knock out the sidewall of the house to get the shot. First, let's change the default keyframe interpolation. Go to Edit, Editor Preferences, Content Editors, Level Sequence Editor. In the previous video on Unreal Character Animation, we changed this key interpolation to linear. For smooth acceleration and deceleration of our camera, We want to change that back to auto. Move to the first frame of the camera movement. For us, that's the 0 point on the timeline. Line up the framing of the camera as desired, and then set a transform keyframe for the camera. We'll also keyframe the focus. Another quick note, if you use the focus eyedrops picker to set focus like we are here, you need to use the eyedropper in the standard perspective view. It won't work if you try to use it in your camera cinematic view. You'll find the manual focus distance property is already waiting for you in the sequence editor, so all you need to do is click to add a keyframe. Now we'll move to the end of the camera move. Adjust the camera framing. And set another transform key. And set the focus. And finally, add a focus distance key. We'll turn the focus debug plane back on and scrub through the timeline. A few times Jennifer gets ahead of the focus, so we'll set a couple of in-between keyframes to keep the focus pull consistent. Again, be thinking about how much focus pull work will be required on the real set to get the shot. Turn off the debug plane when you're done. Play back the timeline. If you find that the camera doesn't quite follow the action all the way, you may need to add additional interim transform keyframes to guide the camera path. In our case, the move actually looks pretty good. Okay, at this point, you could render out each camera and head to your favorite NLE, but Unreal Engine actually can handle the editing quite nicely right from the sequencer timeline. At the very top of the sequence editor is a camera cuts track. If there are already any clips in the cuts track, just select and delete them. Rewind to the start of the sequence and select your first camera using the Add Camera button in the Camera Cuts track header. We'll start with our moving foot camera. To see the camera cuts track in the viewer, make sure the cinematic viewer is the last active viewer, click into it if it wasn't, and then click the Lock Viewport button on the track header. Now move to the point on the timeline where you'd like to make your first edit. Click the Add Camera button and choose the camera you'd like to switch to. Continue to add camera angles until your edit's complete. Sometimes the alternate cameras can make it tough to see the shot you're looking at. So at this point, go ahead and enable Game View Mode to hide camera and light icons. You can drag the borders between clips to change the timing. And to completely change out an angle, select the portion of the camera cuts track, right-click, and choose from the list of alternate angles in the Change Camera section. Time to render out the video. We'll start by moving our playhead to the last frame we want to render out, right-clicking and choosing Set End Time. Click the Render to Video button. Choose Frame Rate, Compression, Output Format Options, and Destination folder, and replace the automatic labeling with your custom scene name, in our case, Scene 01. There are additional options available if you expand the sections. Click Capture Movie and save any unsaved files in your Unreal Engine project when prompted. Unreal will play your movie as it renders. Now to render out individual cameras, at least at the time we recorded this, you'll need to add each camera as a single cut on the Camera Cuts track and then use the same render procedure as before. Unreal Engine has an elaborate system of nesting of sequences, cuts, and scenes, but our recommendation is to keep things simple the way we've shown you. For each new scene you're trying to previs, create a unique level sequence. For alternate cuts, duplicate your current sequence and call it, say, Scene 01 Alt 1. To create a new scene that uses the same set, just create a brand new sequence. Be aware, though, that changes you make to props, lights, or cameras that haven't been keyframed in other sequences will cause those objects to be relocated in the scenes you've already built. If in doubt, you can create a completely unique stage and a unique set of cameras and lights. To do this, head back to Content and then drill down to Starter Content, Maps. Locate Minimal Default. That's the original stage we just built. Duplicate it and rename it something like Staging 02. While we're at it, let's rename the original Minimal Default to the more helpful Staging 1. This is a completely unique copy of the scene. To prove it, let's delete the couch. If we now double-click Staging 1 to open it again, you'll see that the couch still happily exists in this original staging. Be aware that the scene sequences you create will only work with the staging maps you were using when you created them. So if you created a scene in Staging 1 sequence editor, you'll need to double-click and load Staging 1 before the scene looks correct. And that's a wrap. You now have what you need to experiment with your scene setups and make all the mistakes you like. They're a whole lot cheaper to make in Unreal Engine than they are on a fully staffed film set.
I wanted you and my children to have everything.
I hate the money, and I hate this house. Alice wouldn't have married that fortune hunter.